Marcus Chen had been training in martial arts since he was 7 years old. His father, a former military officer, believed that discipline and physical strength would shape his son into a better man. Every morning before school, Marcus would practice his kicks and punches in their small backyard. His neighbors often heard the sound of his fists hitting the wooden practice dummy that his father had built for him. By the time Marcus turned 25, he had earned black belts in 3 different martial arts disciplines. He worked as a security guard at a large shopping mall during the day, but his real passion was competing in underground fighting tournaments on weekends. These fights weren't legal, but they paid well, and Marcus needed the money to support his younger sister's college education. The tournaments took place in abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of the city. Men from all walks of life came to test their skills against each other. There were no rules except one: no weapons allowed. Marcus had built a reputation as someone who never backed down from a challenge, no matter how big or intimidating his opponent might be. One evening, after winning his 3rd fight of the month, Marcus was walking home through the city center when he noticed a commotion near the royal palace. A crowd had gathered around the main gates and people were shouting angrily. Marcus pushed through the crowd to see what was happening. An elderly woman was on her knees, crying and pleading with 2 royal guards who stood like stone statues in their ceremonial uniforms. The woman was holding a piece of paper in her shaking hands, trying to show it to the guards, but they refused to look at it. Marcus could hear her saying something about her son, about justice, about needing help from the king himself. The royal guards were known throughout the kingdom for their rigid training and unwavering loyalty to the crown. They were selected from the best soldiers in the army and underwent years of special preparation. Their job was to protect the royal family and maintain order around the palace grounds. They were not supposed to show emotion or get involved in personal matters of common citizens. One of the guards, a tall man with a thick mustache, finally spoke to the old woman. His voice was cold and dismissive as he told her to leave immediately or face arrest. The woman tried to explain that her son had been wrongfully imprisoned and that she had evidence of his innocence, but the guard waved his hand as if shooing away a bothersome fly. Marcus watched as the second guard grabbed the woman's arm roughly and began pulling her away from the palace gates. The elderly woman stumbled and nearly fell, her papers scattering across the ground. The crowd around them murmured with disapproval, but no one dared to interfere with the royal guards. Something inside Marcus snapped when he saw how the guards were treating the defenseless old woman. He had grown up learning that strength should be used to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. His father had always taught him that a true warrior fights for justice, not just for victory or money. Without thinking about the consequences, Marcus stepped forward from the crowd. He called out to the guards, asking them to show some respect to the elderly woman. His voice was firm but not aggressive. He simply wanted them to listen to what she had to say instead of treating her like a criminal. The guard with the mustache turned toward Marcus with anger flashing in his eyes. He demanded to know who Marcus thought he was, interfering with official royal business. The guard's hand moved to the ceremonial sword at his side, a clear warning for Marcus to back away and mind his own business. But Marcus had seen too much injustice in his life to walk away now. He took another step forward and repeated his request for the guards to treat the woman with basic human dignity. The crowd behind him grew silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The tension in the air was thick as both royal guards now focused their attention on Marcus. The one with the mustache, whose name was Captain Roderick, had served the royal family for 15 years without anyone ever questioning his authority. He was not about to let some common citizen challenge him in front of a crowd. Captain Roderick released his grip on the elderly woman and walked toward Marcus with slow, deliberate steps. His heavy boots echoed against the stone pavement as he approached. The second guard, a younger man named Lieutenant Hayes, positioned himself to block any escape route Marcus might try to use. The crowd pressed closer, forming a circle around the confrontation. Some people pulled out their phones to record what was happening, while others whispered prayers under their breath. Everyone knew that challenging a royal guard was considered an act of treason, punishable by immediate imprisonment or worse. Captain Roderick stopped just inches from Marcus's face. He was slightly taller and broader, his uniform decorated with medals earned through years of loyal service. His breath smelled of coffee and tobacco as he spoke in a low, menacing voice. He told Marcus that he had exactly 5 seconds to apologize and leave, or he would be arrested for disturbing the peace and disrespecting the crown. Marcus looked into the captain's eyes and saw years of blind obedience and unchecked power. He thought about all the times he had watched stronger people abuse weaker ones, and how he had promised himself he would never become someone who turned away from injustice. His martial arts training had taught him that true strength came from protecting others, not from intimidating them. Instead of backing down, Marcus calmly explained that he wasn't trying to cause trouble. He simply believed that the elderly woman deserved to be heard, especially if she had evidence that could prove her son's innocence. He spoke respectfully but firmly, never raising his voice or making any threatening gestures. The captain's face turned red with rage. No one had ever spoken to him like this in public, especially not some nobody from the crowd. He reached out to grab Marcus by the shirt, intending to drag him away just as he had done with the old woman. But Marcus was ready. Years of fighting experience had taught him to read body language and anticipate his opponent's moves. As the captain's hand came toward him, Marcus smoothly stepped to the side and caught the guard's wrist in a firm grip. For a moment, both men stood frozen in this position. The captain was shocked that someone had dared to touch him, while Marcus was calculating his next move. The crowd gasped collectively, realizing they were witnessing something that had never happened before in the kingdom's history. Lieutenant Hayes immediately reached for his weapon, but Marcus was faster. Using a technique he had learned in his martial arts training, Marcus twisted the captain's wrist and used his momentum to spin him around. In one fluid motion, he swept the captain's legs and brought him down to the ground. The impact wasn't hard enough to cause serious injury, but it was enough to demonstrate that the captain was not invincible. Captain Roderick found himself sitting on the cold stone pavement, looking up at Marcus with a mixture of shock and humiliation. The crowd erupted in gasps and excited chatter. Some people cheered, while others covered their mouths in disbelief. Never in their lives had they seen anyone successfully challenge a royal guard, let alone bring one down without breaking a sweat. Lieutenant Hayes drew his sword and pointed it at Marcus, shouting for him to surrender immediately, but Marcus remained calm and kept his hands visible, showing that he had no intention of continuing the fight. He had made his point without seriously hurting anyone. Captain Roderick struggled to his feet, his face burning with embarrassment and fury. His carefully maintained image of invincibility had been shattered in front of dozens of witnesses. His uniform was dusty, and his ceremonial hat had fallen off during the brief encounter, revealing his thinning gray hair. The lieutenant kept his sword pointed at Marcus while helping his superior officer stand up. The blade gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as other guards came running from their posts around the palace. Within minutes, Marcus found himself surrounded by 6 armed men, all looking ready to strike him down for his unprecedented act of defiance. But something unexpected happened next. Instead of attacking Marcus or ordering his immediate arrest, Captain Roderick held up his hand to signal his men to wait. He brushed the dust off his uniform and picked up his hat, all while studying Marcus with newfound curiosity. The captain had been in many fights during his military career, but he had never encountered someone who could move with such precision and control. Marcus hadn't tried to hurt him seriously, even though he clearly had the skill to do much more damage. This suggested either exceptional training or remarkable restraint, possibly both. Meanwhile, the elderly woman who had started this whole confrontation was still clutching her papers, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and her 22-year-old son Diego had been arrested 3 weeks earlier for allegedly stealing from a wealthy merchant. Elena knew her son was innocent because he had been with her at the hospital during the time of the theft, caring for his sick grandmother. The merchant who had accused Diego was known for his connections to corrupt officials. He had a history of falsely accusing young men from poor families, knowing they couldn't afford good lawyers to defend themselves. Elena had spent her life savings trying to hire an attorney, but every lawyer she approached seemed afraid to take on a case that might anger powerful people. Captain Roderick walked slowly around Marcus, examining him like a general studying a new recruit. He asked Marcus about his background, his training, and why he had chosen to intervene in a matter that didn't concern him. Marcus answered honestly, explaining his martial arts background and his belief that everyone deserved to be treated with basic respect. The crowd remained silent, hanging on every word of this surreal conversation. Many of them had their own stories of injustice, their own family members who had been mistreated by the system. They saw Marcus as someone who had finally done what they had all wanted to do, but never had the courage to attempt. As Marcus spoke, Captain Roderick noticed something in the young man's eyes that he hadn't seen in years of dealing with criminals and troublemakers. There was no hatred, no desire for violence or revenge. There was only a genuine concern for doing what was right, even at great personal risk. The captain found himself thinking about his own son, who was about Marcus's age. His boy had joined the military but had been struggling with following orders that he felt were morally wrong. Captain Roderick had always told him that a soldier's job was to obey without question, but seeing Marcus's principled stand made him reconsider his own beliefs. Lieutenant Hayes was growing impatient with his superior's hesitation. He whispered urgently that they needed to arrest Marcus immediately and make an example of him. If word spread that someone could attack a royal guard without consequences, it would encourage others to rebel against authority. But Captain Roderick was wrestling with thoughts he had never allowed himself to have before. He had spent 15 years following orders without questioning whether they were just or fair. He had convinced himself that maintaining order was more important than considering individual cases of suffering or injustice. Now, looking at Elena Vasquez's tear-stained face and the papers she held so desperately, he began to wonder what might happen if he actually took the time to listen to what she had to say. What if her son really was innocent? What if his rigid adherence to protocol had prevented him from helping someone who truly needed help? The moment of decision had arrived for Captain Roderick. His entire career, his reputation, and his standing with the royal family hung in the balance. Every protocol he had ever learned told him to arrest Marcus immediately and send Elena away without listening to her pleas. But something deeper was stirring in his conscience. Marcus remained perfectly still, his hands at his sides, showing no signs of aggression despite being surrounded by armed guards. His calm demeanor in the face of overwhelming odds impressed even the other guards, who had expected him to either flee or fight desperately like a cornered animal. Captain Roderick made a decision that would change everything. He turned to Elena, and in a voice that carried across the silent crowd asked her to explain her situation. The elderly woman's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they were tears of hope rather than despair. Elena's voice trembled as she began to tell her story. She explained that her son Diego worked 2 jobs to support their family after his father died in a construction accident. On the day he was accused of theft, Diego had been at the hospital with her and his dying grandmother. She had hospital records, witness statements, and even security camera footage that proved Diego's innocence. The merchant who had accused Diego, a man named Victor Castellanos, owned several businesses throughout the city. Elena had tried to approach him directly to clear up the misunderstanding, but his security guards had thrown her out of his office. When she went to the police, they told her that Castellanos was a respected businessman and that her son must be lying. As Elena spoke, Marcus noticed that Lieutenant Hayes and several other guards were shifting uncomfortably. Their expressions suggested they had heard similar stories before, but had been trained to dismiss such claims as desperate lies from the families of criminals. Captain Roderick listened carefully to every detail Elena provided. When she finished speaking, he asked to see the evidence she had brought. Elena handed him a manila folder containing hospital admission records, signed statements from nurses and doctors, and photographs that clearly showed Diego in the hospital room during the alleged time of the theft. The captain examined each document carefully. His years of military training had taught him how to spot forged papers and false evidence, but everything Elena had brought appeared to be genuine. The timestamps on the hospital records matched her story perfectly, and the witness statements were signed by credible medical professionals. Meanwhile, Marcus watched this unprecedented scene unfold with growing amazement. He had expected to be arrested or possibly beaten by the guards, but instead, he had somehow sparked a moment of genuine justice. The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread through the nearby streets that something extraordinary was happening at the palace gates. Lieutenant Hayes approached his captain and whispered urgently that they were creating a dangerous precedent. If they started listening to every person who claimed their family member was innocent, they would be overwhelmed with similar cases. He argued that their job was to maintain order, not to investigate individual claims of injustice. But Captain Roderick was already thinking beyond his immediate duties. He realized that if Diego was truly innocent, then a real thief was still free while an innocent young man rotted in prison. Moreover, if Castellanos had deliberately framed Diego, it suggested a level of corruption that went far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. The captain made another decision that shocked everyone present. He announced that he would personally escort Elena to the prison where her son was being held, and that he would review the case with the authorities there. He also stated that Marcus would not be arrested, as he had acted with honorable intentions and had shown remarkable restraint in his actions. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause and cheers. Many people were crying with joy at seeing this unexpected display of compassion from someone they had always viewed as an inflexible enforcer of harsh rules. Children who had been hiding behind their parents now stepped forward to get a better look at the captain, who had chosen mercy over protocol. Lieutenant Hayes stared at his superior in disbelief. In 15 years of service together, he had never seen Captain Roderick deviate from established procedures, let alone publicly side with a civilian against official policy. He wondered if his captain had lost his mind, or if he was experiencing some kind of emotional breakdown. Word of the confrontation at the palace gates spread throughout the city faster than wildfire. By evening, news outlets were reporting on the unprecedented event where a trained fighter had challenged royal guards and somehow convinced them to listen to a citizen's plea for justice. Social media buzzed with videos captured by witnesses, and Marcus's name became known throughout the kingdom. Captain Roderick kept his promise to Elena. The next morning, he arrived at the central prison wearing his full dress uniform, accompanied by Elena, and carrying all the evidence she had gathered. The prison warden, a corrupt official named Thomas Blackwood, was visibly nervous when he saw the captain approaching his office. Warden Blackwood had been expecting this visit ever since he heard about the incident at the palace. He knew that Diego's case was problematic because the evidence against the young man was weak and largely based on Castellanos' testimony. However, he had been paid handsomely to ensure that Diego remained locked up regardless of any appeals or new evidence. Captain Roderick presented Elena's evidence to the warden and demanded an immediate review of Diego's case. He also requested to speak with Diego personally to hear his side of the story. Warden Blackwood tried to stall, claiming that such procedures would take weeks to arrange and required approval from higher authorities. But the captain had anticipated this resistance. He had spent the previous evening researching the legal procedures for emergency case reviews, and had discovered that he had the authority to demand immediate action when new evidence suggested a wrongful imprisonment. Armed with this knowledge, he insisted that Diego be brought to them within the hour. Meanwhile, Marcus had returned to his job at the shopping mall, but he found it impossible to focus on his routine duties. Customers and co-workers kept approaching him to ask about the incident, and his supervisor had received several calls from news reporters wanting to interview the man who had stood up to the royal guards. Marcus was uncomfortable with all the attention. He had never intended to become a public figure or a symbol of resistance against authority. He had simply seen an injustice and felt compelled to act, just as his father had taught him to do. The idea that his actions might inspire others to stand up for what was right was both exciting and terrifying. Back at the prison, Diego Vasquez was brought to the warden's office in chains, looking confused and frightened. He was a thin young man with kind eyes and calloused hands from years of manual labor. When he saw his mother, he broke down in tears, having feared he would never see her again. Captain Roderick interviewed Diego carefully, asking detailed questions about his whereabouts on the day of the alleged theft. Diego's answers matched his mother's story perfectly, and he was able to provide additional details that only someone who had actually been at the hospital would know. The captain then requested to see all the evidence that had been used to convict Diego. What he found shocked him to his core. The case file was remarkably thin, containing only Castellanos' written accusation and a statement from one of his employees who claimed to have seen Diego near the store at the time of the theft. There were no fingerprints, no security camera footage from the store, and no physical evidence linking Diego to the crime. The employee's statement was vague and contradictory, and it became clear that the conviction had been based primarily on Castellanos' word and the assumption that a poor young man must be guilty. Captain Roderick confronted Warden Blackwood about the obvious flaws in the case. The warden became defensive and claimed that he had simply processed the paperwork that had been given to him by the courts. But the captain's years of military investigation experience allowed him to see through the warden's lies. As the evidence mounted that Diego was innocent, Captain Roderick realized that he was uncovering a much larger problem. If Castellanos could so easily have an innocent person imprisoned, how many other young men from poor families had suffered the same fate? How many other families had been destroyed by this corrupt system? The captain made another crucial decision. He ordered Diego's immediate release and announced that he would personally investigate Castellanos' business practices and his connections to corrupt officials. This declaration sent shockwaves through the prison staff, many of whom had profited from the existing system of corruption. The release of Diego Vasquez became a turning point not just for his family, but for the entire kingdom. News of his exoneration and the corruption that had led to his imprisonment spread rapidly, inspiring other families who had similar stories to come forward with their own cases of injustice. Captain Roderick found himself overwhelmed with requests for help from people who had previously been too afraid to speak out. His investigation into Castellanos revealed a web of corruption that reached deep into the legal system, involving judges, prosecutors, and prison officials who had been taking bribes to ensure convictions of innocent people. Marcus, meanwhile, had become an unlikely hero to many citizens who saw him as someone who had sparked this wave of reform. He received job offers from security companies and invitations to appear on television shows, but he declined most of them. He preferred to continue his quiet work at the mall while occasionally helping Captain Roderick interview witnesses and review evidence in corruption cases. The partnership between Marcus and Captain Roderick grew stronger as they worked together to expose the corrupt network. Marcus's street-smart instincts combined perfectly with the captain's official authority and investigative skills. They discovered that Castellanos had been operating his scheme for over 5 years, falsely accusing dozens of young men and splitting the profits with corrupt officials. Elena Vasquez became an advocate for other families affected by wrongful imprisonment. She used her experience navigating the legal system to help other mothers and fathers who were trying to prove their children's innocence. Her small apartment became an unofficial headquarters where families shared information and supported each other through their struggles. Diego, after spending 3 weeks in prison for a crime he didn't commit, struggled to readjust to freedom. The experience had traumatized him, but it had also given him a deep appreciation for justice and truth. He decided to study law, hoping to become a defense attorney who could protect other innocent people from suffering as he had. Lieutenant Hayes initially resisted his captain's new approach to their duties, but gradually came to understand that true strength came from protecting justice rather than simply following orders. He began to see that their role as royal guards could be expanded to include ensuring that the kingdom's laws were applied fairly to all citizens, regardless of their social status or wealth. The royal family itself took notice of Captain Roderick's actions and the positive changes they had brought about in the kingdom. Rather than punishing him for deviating from protocol, they praised his initiative and officially expanded his duties to include investigating cases of potential corruption within the legal system. Castellanos was eventually arrested and charged with conspiracy, fraud, and bribery. His trial revealed the full extent of his criminal network, leading to the dismissal of several corrupt judges and the reform of prison policies. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to all the families he had wronged. Marcus continued his work at the shopping mall, but he also began teaching martial arts classes in the evenings. His students learned not just fighting techniques, but also the importance of using their strength to protect others and stand up for what was right. He told them that true victory came not from defeating opponents, but from making the world a more just place. The incident at the palace gates became legendary throughout the kingdom. Parents told their children the story of the young fighter who had shown that one person's courage could change everything. Schools began teaching about civic responsibility and the importance of speaking out against injustice. Years later, Captain Roderick would reflect on how a single moment of conscience had transformed his entire understanding of duty and honor. He had learned that following rules blindly was not the same as serving justice. and that sometimes the most courageous thing a person could do was to question authority when it failed to protect the innocent. Marcus never regretted his decision to intervene that day. Even though it had dramatically changed his quiet life, he had discovered that standing up for others not only helped them, but also revealed strengths within himself that he had never known existed. The ripple effects of his actions continued to spread throughout the kingdom, creating a legacy of justice that would inspire future generations to choose courage over comfort when faced with moral challenges.